Okay, good morning, everyone. So we're going to continue our study through Likutei Moharan. Specifically today, we're going to look at the lesson in part two, lesson number 25. Now, if you remember, last week we studied what Rabbi Nachman of Breslov had to say about hitbodedut, this idea of pleading to God, reaching out to God, and forming a unique personal relationship with God for the purpose of bitul, making oneself transparent, so that God's light shines through you, and so that you can encompass yourself in the reality of God. Right? And that is really one of the major goals of Jewish life, right? Community is the other major goal, but in addition to community, you have to develop this personal relationship with God. You have to engage in hitbodedut, which is drawing close to God, drawing near to God. He talked to us in that lesson that we studied last week all about why you should be doing this and what are the philosophical and theological reasons why you should be doing this. But he didn't exactly give us any practical advice. This lesson is his practical guide to hitbodedut. Okay, so now he's going to actually talk to us about what you should be doing and how you should be doing it. Let's get started. So he begins by saying hitbodedut is the highest asset and greater than everything. Okay, so again, you can see the weight that the Breslovers place on this practice of personally drawing close to the divine, right? They see it as the highest thing you can do, right? It's ma'ala elyona gdola min hakol, right? It's the highest of the heights and the greatest thing from everything. So if you can achieve this, if you can make time for this, well, yeah, this is what you should be making time to do. And what exactly is hitbodedut? So that is to set aside for oneself at least 1 hour or more. So now he's giving us a time. How long should this take? Ultimately, this should take you an hour or more as you increase, right? But you should be trying to set aside an hour or more, secluding oneself in some room or a field. Now, remember in his last lesson, he said this should take place on a road, right? So he's modifying it a little here. I think he's realizing, right, that a road may not be the easiest place to find, a secluded road. It may not be the best thing. So what he's saying is that if you can't find your road to do this on, your secluded road, you should find some room, right? He says that you should, it's, be'eza cheder o basadeh, right? In some room or in a field, okay? And Rabbi Nachman loved nature. And there's a story of him talking about how he used to go with his disciples for walks in the fields, right? And he would say to his disciples as he walked through the field, listen to how beautifully the grass is singing to God, how each blade of grass sings, and nature sings to God without any ulterior motive. And so therefore doing hitbodedut in nature, right, is beneficial because then you join in the song of nature without any ulterior motive, right? So that's why he likes the idea of doing this in a field if you can, right? Because that way you take on the aspect of nature, which just sings to God because that's what it does. It sings, right? And each blade of grass in a field is singing to God, and that will help you in your hitbodedut by surrounding yourself with the song of nature, right? And of course, right, in a room, if there's nothing else that you can do, okay? And using, and this is the one phrase I always find very bizarre, but this is how it's translated, right? Using claims and excuses, speak one's peace with one's maker, using words that evoke favor, placate, and conciliate in order to entreat and plead with God that he bring one closer to him, to genuine divine worship, okay? So your goal is an hour, or more if you really want to, but your goal is an hour, right? And Rabbi Nachman knows that you're not going to get to the hour right away. right? So, right, in notes to this lesson, right, Reb Nosson talks about how the rabbi would say, well, you start with a few minutes and you build up like any practice. But your goal is you want to be able ultimately to set aside 1 hour each day to do this. And as you go higher and higher, you're supposed to try to increase that if you can, right? And you have to use words, right, that evoke favor, that placate, that conciliate, and you're supposed to plead with God. Okay. So this is truly right. And I think what he means by using claims and excuses that you're supposed to also be in some way like, honest with God and like, well, I understand I can't do this or that, right? It's okay to like, make excuses for yourself before God to help you better understand, right, what you need, right? And so that's what this is about. This is about finding out what you need through genuinely conversing with God. And as you find out what you need, then begging God to help direct you how to get there. Okay. So that's the first thing. Now, this is what I find, this is interesting. This prayer and conversation should be in the language one normally uses, one's native tongue. And if you look at the language, it says that this zoyeh belashon shem medabrim bo, right? Dehainu lilshon Ashkenaz. Okay, it's supposed to be in Lashon Ashkenaz, or right, Bimdi Natenu. So what's Lashon Ashkenaz? Yiddish. So remember, this is 1807, well before Eliezer ben Yehuda and his resurrection of Hebrew as a spoken language. So what Rabbi Nachman is saying is, and when you sit down to talk to God, you speak to God in Yiddish, or as it says in the note, Bamdinatenu, in the language of the state, right? The language of the country. So you have to speak to God in the language you normally use, in one native's tongue, right? Because it's difficult for a person to say everything he wants to say in the holy tongue. Well, ain't that the truth? Okay, right? Ain't that the truth? Okay, even in the early 1800s, Rabbi Nachman of Breslov is saying that, how can you can't say what you want to say in the holy tongue in Hebrew. Okay.
That's you just revolutionary.
Well, I guess not really. No. Mm-hmm. But I think what he's admitting is that this is different than what you do in there. Yeah. Right? This is different than what you do in the sanctuary, because in the sanctuary, you're engaging as a community, you're using the holy tongue, and you're praising God, right? Rabbi Nachman in other lessons will equate what we do in there with tehilot, praise of God. But there's two things. There's tehilot and there's bakashot, right? There's begging and pleading to God. The praise of God, which is more of a communal aspect of what we do, takes place in the sanctuary and it takes place in the holy tongue. But when you actually start pleading to God for things that you want, how are you going to plead to God in a language that doesn't really help you feel what you're supposed to feel, right? And it is revolutionary in some way, only because what people like believe in his time were saying is that, again, Yiddish is the language of the home. Yeah. You only talk to God in God's language, right? And what he's saying is no. Now, yes, in the prayers we have Aramaic and things like that, but even Aramaic's no longer a lingua franca by this point.
No, but right? It was, and that's why it was used.
Yeah. Yes.
But it's permission.
Right.
Which alleviates a whole.
Right. And if you think about it, he's not talking to the women who had, as we see from the little synagogue, Yiddish prayer books and things like that. He's talking to the men, right? He's talking to the men in his community who are used to only talking to God in the holy tongue, Lashon Kodesh. And now he's telling these men, you can do what the women do. I mean, if you think about it, he's not coming right out and saying that. But what he's saying is, right, your mothers and your wives and your daughters and all that have these Yiddish prayer books. Well, you can actually do that, not in prayer, but you can actually do what they do and speak in Yiddish when you want to beg and plead before God, right? So yeah, in some way he's giving them permission, but as Maxine points out, there's precedent for this permission because of lingua franca being in our own prayers through the use of Aramaic and things like that, right? But it is interesting, right, to say to someone, you know what, when you sit down and talk to God in the language you know, right? You know Yiddish, talk Yiddish. You know French, talk French. You know Russian, talk Russian, right? You know English, talk English, right? Because like you said, it's difficult for a person to say everything he wants to say in the holy tongue. Also, being unfamiliar with that language, right? One's heart is not moved by the words. Okay. Again, he's admitting, right? We're not familiar with the Lashon Kodesh. The Hebrew is not our familiar language. Therefore, sure, we engage in the praise of God through those words and use the holy tongue, but our heart is not really moved by those words as we're not accustomed to speaking Hebrew. Okay. But in our native tongue, in which we normally speak and converse, it is much easier and so much more likely for one to feel contrition. This is because the heart is drawn to a person's native tongue and closer to it on account of his familiarity with it. Okay? So basically, sure, you're going to pray to God in Hebrew as a community. That's not going to change, right? As a community, you're going to go in that room 3 times a day and you're going to use the holy language and you're going to praise God in the holy tongue. But let's be honest with ourselves. The holy tongue is hard. The holy tongue really doesn't move us. The holy tongue makes it hard for us sometimes to put our heart and soul into what we want to do. So when you're sitting down to have your one-on-one hour with God every day and hash things out with God, use the language that's actually going to move your heart. Okay? And again, that's, I think, is something, there's something very beautiful about this because he's acknowledging that, you know, God, the creator of all, can be spoken to in any of the languages of the world. We're not going to change what we do as Jews as a community. We're still going to go in there 3 times a day, right? And Hebrew is still important. He's not in any way saying that you don't teach Hebrew, right? Or things like that. No, you teach it, but you also encourage people to speak to God in the language that moves them, in the language that will actually allow them to draw close to divinity. And that's what you do in private. That's what you do in private. In private, you speak to God in the language that you understand. Okay. Going on, 25:1-3. And in one's native tongue, one can express oneself fully. Everything that is in his heart, he should express and tell to God, be it remorse and repentance for the past, or pleas to genuinely merit drawing closer to God from this day forward, or the like, each individual according to his level, right? So it really doesn't matter what you say at this point and how you want to say it, as long as it moves you. You got to start somewhere, so you find the level you want to start at, and you start there, and then you continue to build, okay? One should be very careful, though, to make this a daily practice at a scheduled time, but the rest of the day, one should be happy, as mentioned above. So you get 1 hour a day to cry and not be happy. Seriously. But think about that. Now think about what he, right? So everybody gets 1 hour a day to cry and be mad and be sad and to beg and to bleed and to whatever. And then nope, after that, that's it. Now, after that, you got to remember all the other lessons I talked to you about after that, because it's a mitzvah to be happy and you have to do everything with happiness and with zeal and with joy. Right? And think about it. If you knew every day you had 1 hour where you could just sit and cry and pull your hair out and scream, right, primally, maybe that would help us be happy the rest of the day, because we knew that we would actually have a time to unburden ourselves every day, right? That's why this is such a fascinating practice, because what he's saying is every day it's going to build up and build up and build up, and you're going to strive all the time to be happy, and you're going to do that. And if you don't have a stopgap somehow, right, to let it out, it's going to affect your ability to actually be happy. So you get 1 hour a day, 1 hour a day to just say, oh my God, I'm nothing, I'm worthless, I didn't do this, I didn't do that. God help me, this isn't going right, that isn't going, and you get right, and you get 1 hour a day to work it out. I mean, I actually like this idea, right? Personally.
Similar to they say you should schedule your worries. That's what they tell you now, right? Set aside a time, worry, and then put it aside.
Right. Well, Rabbi Nachman was doing that in the 1800s, right? Was doing that in the 1800s, right?
Clear perspective while you try to find a secluded spot.
Well, that too. Yes, it does also, right, bring into perspective, right? I would think so. Yes, right. But yeah.
You say he had depression?
Yes, he probably had some type of depression or mental illness. So he gave himself 1 hour a day to indulge that. But go on, Susan. Yeah, I'm sorry. You were.
Well,
Yeah.
I don't know. Because when I was undergoing depression, there was no way that I could kind of schedule it. It was just basic.
I know. And I think this is why. So what he's saying is he's trying very hard to get sort of like a mental discipline going, mental hygiene, right? Because he doesn't want the depression. So he's trying little by little to kind of, I think, rein it in. Right, at least I think, right. Again, we only have his writings to understand what he probably was doing, but these writings, I think, are talking about the fact that he recognizes exactly what you said. Depression is pervasive, right? And so he's trying to find ways to help him rein it in, right? And I think that's why his goal is he wants to be able to limit his depression to an hour a day, right? And really indulge that and everything. Now that's going to take God knows how much mental strength and work, right? But I think that's ultimately what he's trying to do here, right? And again, and it's not like Rabbi Nachman, like, he's on the derech with everybody else, right? It's not like he's perfected these practices, right? He's doing this with his community, it seems, right? And he's guiding them, and he's higher on the path than they are, right? On some ways, but he's doing this, right? But yeah, I agree, right? This is a very lofty goal to say I'm going to confine my worry and my depression and everything to 1 hour a day, and then the rest of the day I'm going to be happy, right? So, any other questions at the moment?
This happiness, this cheerful countenance is important to inspire other people not to be down and to be grateful.
Yeah.
And that's like a role modeling.
Yeah. Yeah.
This is a characteristic of their sect.
Oh yes, it's a very deep characteristic of the Breslov sect. The Breslov sect is all about finding joy and happiness, as we'll see next week when we do another lesson that talks about, how you should foster this sense of joy in your life, right? And again, it's not joy like we pretend the evil of the world doesn't exist, right? But it's even in the midst of it, we find the good. Right? Because remember, it's not about pretending evil doesn't exist. It's not about somehow saying, oh yeah, everything is fine and just hunky-dory. What it is looking at everything, even the stuff that's bad, quote unquote, right? And trying to find that one piece of good so that thing is not then entirely bad in your estimation. Right. And using that to build. So that's what joy and happiness, that's where it comes from. It doesn't come from being Pollyannish and naive and being like, oh yeah, the world's on fire around me, but this is fine, and I'm going to smile. Right. It's actually looking at the things that are troublesome and at least at the beginning, trying to find that piece of good. Marnie.
Yeah. I just turned the page in my notebook.
Yeah.
And it says, do not worry about tomorrow because you do not even know what might happen to you today.
Right.
Yiddish proverb.
Right. Yeah.
And so
right. And remember Rabbi Nachman's lesson about why today is so important, because tomorrow doesn't even exist. The future, right?
You just
yeah.
compartmentalize it.
Right, right. And notice how he's doing that, right? He is compartmentalizing. And I think that's a mental tactic, right? To have to deal with some of his mental illnesses. He's trying to find ways to compartmentalize his illness, right? So that he can then function in the world, right? And I think that's, again, like when something bothers us during the day, do we let it affect our whole day? Or, do we kind of say what Rabbi Nachman did, which is, okay, this is bothering me right now, but this isn't my hour to have my heart out with God about why this is bothering me. So I'm going to look at this thing that's bothering me and find the good in it, that little piece of good in it, so I can go on my day and be settled and have yeshuv da'at and have my settled mind, which was last lesson, right? And draw out that little bit of happiness. And then tonight, when I have my hour of drawing close to God, we'll address this, right? And I'll have my hour of just crying and screaming and pulling out my hair before God that this happened, right?
I would think that's very.
Well, of course it is. No one is ever saying that Rabbi Nachman's lessons are easy. This is some of the most difficult stuff, I think, that, yes. Yeah, and that's what Rabbi Nachman is saying. You got to practice, right? Because again, he's not saying that we do this like this. Nowhere in the Breslover literature, does he ever say, oh, and by the way, this is a snap. Right? No, what he's saying is, if you want to engage in this work, if you want to get on this path, you're going to work for it. You're going to work for it every step of the way, but it's beneficial. It's the best thing you can do for yourself, and it's going to give you great benefit in life, and it's actually going to increase your relationship with God and draw you closer to God. But it's some of the hardest stuff you will ever do as a Jew, right? Rabbi Nachman is never in any way saying that it's easy to be a Breslover. Right? And that these are easy practices to take up. But what he's saying is, if you can do it, if you're able to get on this road, you're going to find this is some of the most worthwhile stuff you could ever do, right? And it's going to improve your life. That's what he believes, right? I mean, and again, that's what I think makes this stuff so compelling, because he never says, anybody can do this. You can just do this tomorrow. Right? I mean, think about it. And Alan, I think you were talking to me about this, right? When are you going to find that hour? I'm tired at night, right? I'm tired at night. I mean, I know David. David was a tzaddik, and gosh, he had that magical harp over his bed, and he didn't seem to mind getting up at midnight, right? But there are some times at midnight that last night I was glad that I could feed the dogs at 9 and not 9:30, and I went to bed, right? Right? So, I mean, right? And so, like, he's saying all of this knowing that people live lives. Right? He's not saying all of this thinking that we all live in some magical world where we can just, pluck time for this out of, right? But he's saying, find the time. Find the time. Do something, that works.
Fine. You make the time.
Okay, thank you. Even better, right? Make the time, right? Make the time, right? Yeah. Oh, sorry. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
It's the process that's important.
Right.
Had he lived during our time, there just would have been a pill for it.
Well,
Right.
true, but true. But you know what?
He was working with what he had.
Yes, he was working with what he had. But I would also say that having a pill for it has sometimes not been the most beneficial thing,
Right,
because it doesn't actually help us work through the issues. For some people, not all, right? All it does is put the Band-Aid on, put the quick fix on, and you don't really work through it, right? That's why in the States and even in Canada, psychedelics as a medical treatment are having a renaissance, and there's serious conversation about using psychedelics in a therapeutic way because of the fact that we're finding as human beings that we just have Band-Aids this thick on us, and that's it. We're not actually working and doing the mental stuff we need to do to help us go forward. And this was a way long before, because I don't think any magic mushrooms grew in the Ukraine. I could be wrong about that. And long before, the advent of Prozac and, MAOI inhibitors and things like that, that you could try to help your mind work through these things. And what he's saying is it has deep religious, theological, and philosophical impact if you can do this, right?
I think we should put it into historical perspective. This was Ukraine.
Yes.
The home of pogroms.
Yeah.
So they were living this every single day. Certainly your mind had to be sharp.
Yes.
To stay alive.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and I think that's also very important, right? Because yes, you have to remember, this is Ukraine in 1800. right? Because he's writing these lessons between 1800 and 1810. His community is not having an easy time about it, right, Susan? Yeah.
I was just gonna say, if you only focus on beliefs and everything that everybody did wrong to you, then you never move forward. Gotta,
Right.
well, find the good, but you've gotta have other thoughts, because you're just gonna sink back into yourself.
And that's what he's talking about, right? That depression and sadness disconnect us and draw us in. He's talking about things that reconnect us, right? And as Ari always points out, which is true, right? In addition to the pogroms and the surrounding culture, which is hostile, Rabbi Nachman got kicked out of a lot of his communities for philosophy like this, because they really thought he was just, this ain't Judaism to them, right? So he was in exile and he was constantly thrown out of different communities, right? And he's trying with his group of followers to say, like, listen, I know that we got thrown out of this town or thrown out of that town, but this is the way, and don't hold it against them. Find the bit of good, because you don't want to get drawn into all of this muck of thinking bad, right? As numerous towns are telling him, shoot, go away, right? Get out of here with your at that time radical-ish ideas, right? Okay, so the benefit of this practice is extraordinarily great. It is an extremely good path and guideline for drawing closer to God, because it is a universal guideline that encompasses everything, right? Because there's nothing that you can't not speak to God about, right? So if you do this, it's extremely good for drawing close to God, because you can encompass anything and everything within this practice. There's nothing you can hold back from, right? Because no matter what a person is lacking in worshiping God, even if he is totally and absolutely distant from God's service, he should speak about it all and ask it of God, as mentioned above. Even if occasionally a person's words are sealed and he cannot open his mouth to say anything at all to God, this itself is nonetheless very good. That is, his readiness and his presence before God and his yearning and longing to speak, despite his ability to do so, this in itself is also very good. Also, moreover, it is possible to make a conversation in prayer out of this itself. Right? So even if you don't know what to say, that should be what your conversation is that night with God, right? Not that you should struggle about what to say. You should actually say, God, I just don't know what to say to you tonight, right? And you should actually turn that into your practice, right? A person should cry out and plead to God about this very thing, that he has become so distant he is unable to even speak. He should beg God for compassion and grace, that he take pity on him and open his mouth so that he'll be able to express himself before him, right? And think about how wonderful that is, that even if you're just tongue-tied, then you should just say, God, I'm tongue-tied. Why am I tongue-tied? Why can't I speak to you? Why do I feel so distant from, and then, right? So he always is giving you the starting point, right? There's no way that you can say, I don't even have a starting point, right? Because even if there's nothing to say, turn that into something to say, okay? And no, many, many renowned tzaddikim have related that they attained their high spiritual level only through this practice. The prospective individual will understand by himself the great benefit of this practice, which rises higher and higher. Furthermore, it is a practice that is accessible to all people, from the least to the greatest, for anyone can make use of this practice and thereby come to a high level. Fortunate is the one who grabs hold of this, right? So lest you think that the tzaddikim were born tzaddikim, no, get that thought out of your mind. The Baal Shem Tov wasn't born the Baal Shem Tov, right? The great tzaddiks of old, Moshe wasn't born Moshe, right? He was born Moshe. And then he did this practice, right? And rose up to become Moshe, right? The Baal Shem Tov didn't just walk out of the forest fully formed. The Baal Shem Tov spent years alone in the forest, communing with God, communing with nature, talking with God, raising up step by step by step by step by step, and then finally came out of the forest and shared everything he achieved with the rest of the world. And you can do it too, right? Because Anyone can do it. Get it out of your mind that the tzaddikim just were, came out of like Athena, fully formed in armor out of Zeus's head, right? That's not how it happens. Okay. And so if that Jew can do it, even if that Jew is the Baal Shem Tov, this Jew can do it. You just got to get on the derech. You got to get on the path. You got to make the time. And don't say you don't have a starting point, because your starting point can be, hey, God, I don't have a starting point. Why is that? Okay. And you can have that conversation with God. Okay. In addition, another thing in his guide, in addition, it's good to turn the Torah into prayer. So that's another thing, right? If you're even not comfortable with the fact that you don't really want to start with, well, I really have nothing to say, go back to Torah, because you can turn the Torah into prayer. That is,
The last line of the paragraph before that, I was thinking it looks like it's hanging by, it's hanging he, like the one who grabs hold of it.
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
out of the Torah.
yes, it is. Yeah. Machazikim, and this is she'ochaz, same word. Yeah, right. So just like the Torah, right? The one who grabs onto the Torah, right? That we're saying, right, that's the person that returns, right? So it's, the same language, right? So in a way, you can say that by using that type of language, he's linking this to Torah, right? That grabbing onto this practice and doing it is equivalent to grabbing on to the Torah. Yeah, which segues then into, right, that you can make this out of Torah, right? And how do you do that? Well, when one studies or hears some Torah discourse from a genuine tzaddik, he should make it into a prayer. He should beseech God and plead with him concerning each point mentioned in the discourse. When will he too be worthy of all this? How distant he is from it. And he should ask God to make him worthy of achieving all that is mentioned in the discourse, right? Now, I'm no tzaddik, but you could do it with here, right? This, what we study here today could be the starting point for hitbodedut, right? Wow, we learned about this practice. This practice seems really hard, God. Do you have any insight as to how Rabbi Nachman maybe did this? Can you kind of maybe help me as to when I'm supposed to find time to do this? Because I really liked what we studied before services today. And, I think it would be beneficial for me, but I have no idea how to do this. What am I supposed to do, right? You can talk it through, right? If you go and hear a really inspiring sermon from someone, that could be your hitbodedut that night, right? Wow, that was a really, really good sermon today at shul, and they talked about this, and this was challenging for me, and I didn't really know what to do with this, and I liked this point, and this seems easy, and I just don't know. I mean, using your own words, you can try to work through it, right? And again, this idea of working through things, right? And working it through with God, right? And again, Susan, this goes back to like what I think he's doing mentally, trying to work through his issues, right? And, he's making God into the ultimate therapist in some way, the wise person who desires truth, God will lead on the path of truth, and understanding on his own one thing from another, he will know how to put this into practice in such a way that his words will evoke favor, and he well argued, pleading, placating God, so that he will draw closer to genuine divine worship. Okay, so now think about it. What he's also saying is by doing hitbodedut, it helps what you do in there, right? Because when he's talking about divine worship, right, la avodato be'emet, right, avodah. And we know for us as Jews and for them as Jews, even the 1800s, avodah was what happened in there, the service of God, right? And of course, it's also when we do the mitzvot, right, and engage with Torah. But what he's saying is, hitbodedut, if you do it and take this time and develop this personal relationship, strong personal relationship with God, that actually will draw you closer to God in there and in everything else that you do. It has this sort of ripple effect, right, where you're that center point doing this, but the ripples that come out of that center point, right, will allow you to draw closer to God in the communal prayers and draw closer to God when you do your mitzvot throughout the day, right? So it's a symbiotic relationship, okay? This manner of conversation rises to a very high place, especially when one turns Torah into prayer, which results in very great delight on high. Okay? When you do this, especially if you do it with Torah, right, you invoke such joy in God. Remember what he talks about before. Our actions have divine consequences. When we do something here in this world, it actually has some type of effect on the Godhead, right? And this process of hitbodedut not only changes you, but also changes God. And it should invoke delight in you that you're able to achieve it. And it, by consequence, then evokes delight and joy in the divine. So you're actually helping God be more happy, right? It's not just you, right? You're helping God be more happy and experience more joy in God's creation and in the people Israel, right? And so, yeah, you're not going to start at the highest place. You're going to have to start way down here, and you're going to have to build little by little by little by little by little. But don't worry, because you'll get there, and you're going to see it'll affect everything. It'll affect your relationship with God. It'll affect your relationship with the community. It'll affect your relationship with others. And you'll start to pull more joy just into the world in general. And that's what God ultimately desires, that his children and the world should be happy, not miserable, right? Rabbi Nachman talks in other lessons about how your Judaism should not be a burden. Your Judaism should not cause you to be depressed. Your Judaism should not cause you to be angry or sad. Your Judaism should be that point of goodness. And if your Judaism isn't that for you, well, then maybe you need to have a one-on-one with God and talk about why it isn't that for you. Because ultimately, being a Jew should be the thing that should make you the most happy in the whole world, right? And again, just as, right, we're saying, he said this in Ukraine in the 1800s, right? He said this in Ukraine in the 1800s, where pogroms were practically a weekly, if not a daily occurrence, right? And what did he say to his community? The most joyful thing about your life should be the fact that you're a Jew, right? And that should be the building point to draw even more joy into the world, right? And that's the thing, right? We've lost the joy. We've lost the spark, right? I mean, think about that, right? And that's a good topic for hitbodedut, sitting alone at night. Am I happy being a Jew? No, right? Seriously, that's a very good topic, I think, to talk to God about. Am I happy being a Jew? Right? Am I happy, right, belonging to a community and going to synagogue and making the meals and having my family over and giving tzedakah and, engaging with the disenfranchised and bringing justice into the world? Does that make me happy? Does hearing the Torah make me happy? Does saying the prayers make me happy? What makes me happy about being a Jew? I think that's a wonderful beginning point for hitbodedut, right? Because that's what Rabbi Nachman is ultimately saying. If your Judaism doesn't make you happy, you got to figure out why, right? Because being a Jew should be the most ecstatic thing for us, okay? So going into the high holidays, which is next week, I know it's going to be about a 3.5 hour service, but, does hearing the shofar make me happy, right? Does seeing the kids in the family service make me happy, right? Does the balagan that goes on in the synagogue because this one is talking and that one is moving and that one is and the kid is crying, does that make me happy? Because I'm surrounded by my community while I'm doing this, right? And if it doesn't, why? Why, God? Can we have a conversation about why I'm not happy in my community? Can we have a conversation about why I think that listening to the Torah and reading the Torah is boring and out of date and pathetic? Can we have a conversation about why I don't feel motivated to do anything Jewish in the world anymore? Can we have a conversation about all of this? Right? Because ultimately, that's what Rabbi Nachman encouraging us to do.
So I think many people are
Mhm.
waiting for someone else to give them the spark and inspire them.
Yeah,
The whole point of this is if you don't do the work,
right. You got to inspire
you're
yourself.
not going to get there. Like, I know people wait for the right clergy and people wait for the right aha moment.
Right,
But actually, if they don't invest themselves in it,
right,
then why should they relate to it at all?
right. But if you can't find the spark within yourself, no one's going to give it to you, right? That's ultimately what he's saying. And think about that. From someone who suffers from mental illness and depression, yeah, he's not finding his spark from other people, right? Because he's already got these mental blockades, right? And what is he saying in the Zamra lesson? You got to look in yourself and find that spot of good. And you got to look at others, right? I mean, I can look at you and for me, can find the spark of good in you, and maybe I can tell you about it, but ultimately you have to find your spark of good, and you have to do the work to build. And if we all do it together, right? Because think about it, because that's then with the Breslovers, they're all doing this together, right? So they're all trying to attune themselves to their inner spark. And then you find your inner spark, and you find your inner spark, and you and I, and we all find it. And then we know what our strengths are. And then we know what we can do in community to make the community better. And we know what we can do in our family lives to make our family lives better, because each one in the family has found their inner goodness, their inner spark. And then you see my inner spark and I see yours. And so it kind of has, again, this ripple effect. But it has to come from, like you just said, Maxine, it has to come from in here. No one's going to put it into you. You have to actually find it. And if you've lost it, well, that's what Hippolytus is for. And other things, but that's what Hippolytus is for. If you've lost it, talk to God about it. Don't be afraid to talk to God. Don't only talk to God in there in the holy tongue that really isn't that moving to you. Let's be honest, right? That's what he's kind of saying. Talk to God in a moving way, right? Again, I think that this is such a fascinating way to approach one's Judaism, because it means we have to be responsible for ourselves and our practice of Judaism and how we relate to Judaism. And we have to figure out what gives us or is going to give us that spark. Okay. So we're about 6 minutes away from services. That's it for this lesson. Next week, we're going to talk about, hopefully one of the final lessons. We're going to talk about how you have to be stubborn to achieve this, really. The next lesson is about stubbornness in one's faith. Stubbornness in how one relates to the divine, and that you're gonna rise and you're gonna fall, and you got to be stubborn about getting back on the horse, right? And the lesson that we're going to talk about, I'm sure at least for 2 days, again, as I said, contains the very famous phrase that we always get wrong about the world being a narrow bridge. You're actually going to see that in context, because that's lesson 48. You're going to see exactly what he wrote and how he uses that in context. And I think, again, you're never going to sing Gesher Tzar Meod the same way again. And I hope maybe you've read my article in the Alberta Jewish News, because I talk about that phrase in my little column for Rosh Hashanah. So that's what we're going to be looking at least for 2 days next week. Hopefully, maybe 3. It's a bit of a longer lesson. We'll see how it goes. And I thank you all for continuing to engage with this. And I really do hope that, because again, I am trying to do this for myself, that you take these lessons seriously and try to think about ways to incorporate this into your daily practice. I can tell you it's been challenging for me, but I do try. I've tried and haven't succeeded all the time, but I have been taking, the pearls from these lessons seriously. So I can attest this ain't easy, right? And it's really easy to just say, I'm tired, or this isn't working, or whatever, right? But again, we're going to find out how stubbornness is a very big part of all of this next week. So good Shabbos, everyone. Shabbat Shalom. And we will get ready for services. Have a great day and a wonderful Shabbat.
That's right. 8 o'clock at Fish Creek Park.